Hey, Michael with XForcePC here to talk about some recommended system specs for X-Plane 12. Now this is going to be talking about if you're buying a new system today, and it is around the 1st of March 2022. So again, if you're buying a new system, and then also bear in mind if, the date. If you're watching this a year from now, this may not be valid anymore. So again, this is around March 1st of 2022. Been playing around with the X-Plane Beta, actually Alpha, and I have a pretty good idea of what the system requirements should be, even though the X-Plane people would tell you it's not finished, it's not done yet, etc., etc. But again, I have a pretty good idea. So Intel has leapfrogged AMD in performance on this 12th gen that's just come out recently. And so we're recommending Intel 12th gen for X-Plane 12. That doesn't mean the AMD won't do a good job, it's just not the best. And if you want the best, the Intel is currently the best. So let's talk about the processors here. These are all 12th gen, so they all start with the number 12. And then the last three digits indicate basically how fast it is. So we have the 12400, 12600K, 12700K, and 12900K. And eventually we'll have a 12600 non-K, a 12700 non-K. But we don't have that just yet. So one thing I will say is the most important thing within this generation is this first row, which is going to be clock speed. And so you see the 12400 here is at 4 gigahertz, and then the rest of the chips are in the mid to upper 4 gigahertz range. Now this is what I call typical speed. I'm probably covering it up. This is typical speed. This is the speed that I see while running X-Plane typically. Now there's a lot of variation in Intel frequency, but in my opinion this is the most important statistic here is typical speed. Now they'll quote and they'll say that the max turbo frequency of the 12700K is like 5 gigahertz or whatever it is, 5.1, 5.2, and the same thing on the 12900K and all the others. They have something called a max turbo frequency, and I'll read you their definition. Max turbo frequency is the maximum single core frequency at which a processor is capable of operating using Intel Turbo Boost. Now the max single core frequency really doesn't come into play very often because you're almost never using a single core. So it's almost irrelevant. What's most important is the typical speed within X-Plane that you're seeing. And that's what this is here. So again, I'm not going to read them all to you. The number of cores is largely irrelevant. Anything more than 4 cores is perfectly fine, 4 cores and up. Now that could change, and I've been saying that for years. X-Plane could decide to incorporate, a multi-threaded type setup, but that's very hard to do in gaming. We're seeing it a little bit more in some other games, and I know X-Plane's a simulation, but to the computer it's a game. 4 cores or and up is fine, at least for right now. And I've been saying that for years and years and years and years, and I don't see that changing, but it always could. So as you see, the lowest end chip in the 12th gen, at least that we're dealing with, is 6 core. So all of these meet that requirement. Now you will see here the 12600K adds 4 efficiency cores. So there is a distinction between performance cores, which are called P cores, and efficiency cores, which are called E cores. The E cores are efficiency cores for running background tasks. The performance cores, or P cores, are for running foreground tasks like games or simulators. So really we only care about, for the most part, the performance cores. And as you see, the number of cores goes up as you go this way. But as I mentioned earlier, cores really aren't that important. But do be aware they're there. Now this can affect performance. We have L2 cache and we have secondary cache. I think it's also referred to as L3 cache, if I'm not mistaken. And the more cores you have, the more cache you have. And the cache is really fast memory that sits on the die, on the chip itself. So it doesn't have to go out to system memory or anything like that. It's memory right on the chip. So the more of that you have, the better. And this is actually measured in megabytes. This is an extremely small amount. You know, we talk in terms of gigabytes, you know, 8 gigabytes of system memory, 16, 32 gigs. This is megabytes. Way, way smaller. This is a tiny, tiny, tiny amount. But it's so fast that it does make a performance impact. So you do get more of that as you move this way, and that will make things a little bit faster. But the biggest determining factor is the typical speed. This right here, this column, or this row, I should say. So when it comes to recommending a processor for X-Plane, my recommendation would be one of these two, the 12600K or 12700K. Also, when they come out with their non-K variant, the one that just will not have a K at the end, that would also be recommended as well. The K just means it's unlocked and you can forcibly overclock it, but we have found as time has marched on that the overclocking is sort of dead because they have these things clocked so high to begin with that once you start overclocking, you start running into overheating issues unless you've got some extreme cooling that you're doing. Now stick around, we're going to talk about graphics cards next. That's always a fun topic, as hard as they've been to get. So next is graphics cards. Hey, so let's talk about graphics cards. You may notice these are all NVIDIA cards. Why don't I have any AMD cards listed up here? Well, AMD cards we have found to be somewhat unreliable with X-Plane. We get a lot of Vulkan crashes. So we don't recommend AMD, at least at this time, for, this is March 1st, 2022. We don't recommend AMD for X-Plane at this time due to the Vulkan crashes. And then when you switch to OpenGL, it gets really slow. So anyway, that's why you don't see any AMD stuff up here. Now, this is from slowest to fastest. And one thing that might seem confusing is the fact that the 3060 has 12 gigs of VRAM. It can't effectively use this 12 gigs. NVIDIA did that just to say, well, our card has more VRAM to AMD. This was kind of this is marketing in my opinion. That's marketing. Just trying to say, well, our card at that price point has more VRAM than your card at that price point. And so, because it looks really strange that a 3080 actually has less VRAM than a 3060. So you can see where something looks a little wonky there. Now, when it comes to graphics cards, all of these are good. But if you want to do clouds is where you're going to need a lot of graphics capability. When I say when you want to do clouds, in other words, if you don't want to fly in clear weather all the time, you want to have the 3D clouds, you want to have the fog, that's going to be offloaded to the GPU, and the more GPU you have, the better. As a for instance, Ken's got a computer here that's about 5 years old. It's running a 7th generation, remember we're up to 12th generation, 7th generation Intel processor, and it's using a 10 series graphics card, a 1080. He's got 3 1080p displays, in other words doing triple display, and he gets about 30, 40, 50 frames per second. But when he turns on weather and the 3D clouds, his 30 or 40 frames per second drops below 20. And you have to stay above 20 or the simulation just isn't accurate, and you actually will slow down time. Anyway, you got to stay over 20 frames per second. And what happens is his GPU becomes the bottleneck at that point. So the more GPU, the better, but it also depends on how many displays you have. Now, when it comes to the best bang for the buck, it's really hard to say because GPU prices have been so out of control. But the more you can get, the better. Probably the best one for the money is the 3070 Ti. But what I want to talk about next is various scenarios and what I would recommend, because it's always true. The most GPU you can afford is the best, or is recommended, the most you can afford. But obviously everybody has their limits and has to have a budget. So let's talk about next various scenarios. Okay, so let's talk about what type of graphics card you need for what situation. So RTX 3060 12 gig, I would recommend for someone running a single 1080p. Now you could stretch that to triple 1080p, but when you dial in those clouds, you're probably going to struggle for frame rate a little bit. But definitely a 3060 can support triple 1080p in good weather. And it's just if you turn up those clouds and the fog and all that, and this all is still being worked on right now, so it's hard for me to give you a definitive answer. But I think it's going to chug a little bit on a 3060 with triple 1080. Now we go down to the 3070. I've got triple 1080 listed here. That's the sort of the minimum card I'd recommend for triple 1080. Again, you can do it with a 3060, but it might have struggles with the clouds, and even the 3070 could struggle possibly with clouds. It all depends on how much more they're able to optimize it. I can tell you it struggles now. What I can't do is tell you if it's going to struggle when the final version of X-Plane 12 comes out. For the 3070 Ti, we've got triple 1080 and also a single 4K. Now when it comes to 4K, keep in mind that a 4K monitor, a single 4K, has as many pixels as 4 1080p displays. But it's more efficient and easier to draw a single 4K than it is 3 1080s. So that's something to keep in mind. Now we go down to the 3080, we have triple 1080p. Then we also have triple 1440p, or also known as 2K. And then we have again a single 4K display. And then the same thing is listed here for the 3080 and 12 gig and the 3080 Ti also with 12 gig. Same exact thing, triple 1080p, triple 1440p, or single 4K. And then the 3090 can do all those things, and you can flirt with triple 4K. And I've got these question marks here. It's very touch and go. Triple 4K, and then this is based on version 11. I haven't even tried in version 12. But triple 4K, even in version 11, is very challenging. And really that's generally comes down to a CPU bottleneck more than a GPU bottleneck. Generally, you have to dial down the settings. We'll have to see how things pan out with version 12 if we're able to do, triple 4K effectively. But to this point, triple 4K is something we've recommended people stay away from. Even if you have to buy TVs and they are 4K, we typically recommend set them to 1080p if you want a good frame rate, and especially if you plan to dial in clouds. So, we may have to wait for the 4000 series or maybe 13th generation Intel processors. So hopefully this helps a little bit. I mean, these are just my opinions. These are opinions. These are not written in stone. And depending on how you set things, these could vary. In other words, if you got let's say a 3070 and you did triple 1080p, and then you dragged all the sliders all the way to the right, and you turned the weather all the way up with all the clouds and the fog and everything, then this 3070 probably won't be that great at 1080p. You might need to step up a little bit. So there is some overlap here, and keep that in mind. So next, we're going to talk about RAM. Okay, let's talk about memory or RAM, and we're in a very unusual position right now because you can get 12th gen Intel with DDR4 or DDR5, and it is motherboard specific, MOBO specific. In other words, if you buy a DDR4 motherboard, it will only support DDR4 forever, and if you buy a DDR5 motherboard, it will only support DDR5 forever. And they literally make the same motherboard, DDR5 and DDR4. In other words, the only difference is the support for one RAM or the other. So if you go for DDR4, you will be DDR4 forever. You go for DDR5, you'll be DDR5 forever. The issue is, and I didn't write this up here, but this is 2.5 approximately times the cost. Now again, March 1st, 2022 is the date. So DDR5 is about 2.5 times more costly. So that's the kicker. The motherboards don't really cost anymore. The motherboards cost basically the same for DDR4 or DDR5. Now the typical speeds on our DDR4 we use now is between 3200 and 3600 megatransfers per second, also known as, some people call it megahertz. On DDR5, it's usually between 4800 and 6000 megatransfers or megahertz. I can tell you when you get above about 5200 here, it gets really expensive. So 6000 is crazy, very, very expensive. We're seeing, and everybody's seeing, 0 to 10% performance boost from DDR5 at this time. Now, as DDR5 gets faster and faster down the road, maybe we'll see a bigger difference. But again, it could be anywhere from 0 to 10%. With gaming, it's typically around 5% difference. So you have to think, do I want to spend an extra $200 or $300 to go to DDR5, or should I instead spend $200 or $300 and get a faster processor, which will make more than a 5% difference, or a faster graphics card, which will make more than a 5% difference? Maybe that's where I should spend my money. So, you know, my recommendation is probably going to be to go to DDR4, and that's what we're offering right now as March 1st, 2022. We'll eventually, once it becomes more economically feasible, we will move to DDR5. Now, how much memory do you need? Well, it's DDR5, you want just enough because it's so expensive, but really what makes sense is 16 or 32 gigs right now. Typical X-Plane memory consumption is generally about 6 gig or so. Now, whether or not that'll go up with the fancy clouds and all that, I don't know, but I've never seen anybody have an issue with 16 gig. The only way you could ever push that is if you're running third-party stuff, something really unusual, weird, and then 32 is just kind of a safety. So, you know, RAM, at least DDR4 is not very expensive right now. So if you're going with DDR4, probably try to go with 32, just so you don't have to worry about upgrading it down the road. But really 16 or 32, either one is fine. And yeah, DDR4 until DDR5 comes down. Okay, so let's summarize the recommendations. We're recommending the 12700 or the 12600 from Intel, whether that be the K or the non-K variant of that chip. As far as memory, we're recommending DDR4 now, March 1st, 2022, and DDR5 later. You know, let's say you're watching this video in August, maybe DDR5 has come down. The easiest way to tell is look at our systems and see what we're offering. If we're offering DDR5, that means it's obviously come down. Right now, it is about 2.5 times more expensive. The amount of RAM, 16 to 32 gig, either one is going to do fine. I mean, we offer an overkill system with 64 gig. Obviously, having more RAM isn't going to hurt anything, but is probably unnecessary. And then we're recommending NVIDIA 30 series or 40 series whenever it comes out. Recommending NVIDIA just because NVIDIA plays more nicer with X-Plane, either 11 or 12. We've had some, Vulkan crashing errors with AMD. And as far as which specific NVIDIA card, refer to earlier in the video. It's going to depend on your budget, obviously. As much as you can afford is really the true answer.